In the mid-13th century Bohemia, a monk with trembling fingers in a dark closed-off room worked frantically over a soon-to-be famous book. Time was not on his side at this moment, and knew if he failed his task come morning, he would surely meet his end by the hands of his peers. As the bell of his monastery tolled midnight, the candle he was working by was inexplicably snuffed out by a sudden cold breeze. His prayers were finally answered, but it wasn't God who answered it. It was his fallen angel. Welcome back to Moonlight Lore, everyone. I'm your host, Jordan Hopkins. In this episode, I'm going to be sharing the strange story about the Codex Gigas, commonly referred to as the Devil's Bible, written in 13th century Bohemia. What makes this story and Bible so interesting to me is the legends surrounding it, along with the facts and possible proof of backing it up. In this story, it will take us all the way back to 13th century Europe, which at this time was under severe disarray as the very early threat of war and the Black Death began tightening their grip on parts of the continent. But it was during this time what can only be called a world wonder was born, as a monk out of the Benedictine monastery had completed the incredibly large Codex Gigas. At the time of its completion, it was believed to have summarized and contained all human knowledge and history, while also adding a complete and finished Latin-written Old and New Testament. Not only this, but among its large 620 pages are works of medieval art and world knowledge, medical practices, details on how to conduct proper exorcisms, and different methods of penitence. And though 620 pages is not necessarily long for a book, let alone a Bible containing so much written work, the sheer size of the book is one that truly must be realized. The whole Bible itself requires 2 men to carry it, as it comes at a weight of 165 pounds and stands upright at a height of 36 inches, 20 inches wide, and nearly 9 inches thick. With its bindings made of wood covered in heavy leather and metal fittings, and with the large vellum pages estimated to be made from around 160 donkeys that are also determined to reach over 1,500 square feet, this behemoth of a manuscript is known by historians as the largest known medieval Bible ever written. And although no one truly knows the exact date it was written, a citation in the book hints that its completion was done in the year 1230. But with this in mind, and the size of the Bible being as it is, one might suspect multiple people had worked on this book, as taking on such a task would have been extraordinarily daunting. The truth is, it's firmly believed the book was written by a sole, unknown author over the course of multiple decades, as the penmanship stays consistent throughout the entire book and is written from the same ink made from insect nests. This, however, supports the strange legend behind the book, as over decades of writing, the author's penmanship should have changed ever so slightly enough to notice, but stays so consistent and flawless with no mistakes throughout the entirety of the book, it's plausible to assume it was written in what could be considered a very short amount of time by a single author. Yet this feat seems impossible without the help of inhuman abilities. Those who have had the privilege of reading through the Bible say it's remarkably impressive in its illuminations of many topics it offers. But the page that has caught the eyes of not only historians, but also the public eyes all around the world is page 290, the one page solely dedicated to the devil. Although it's well known Satan has appeared in many medieval books throughout the ages of him interacting with humans, the Codex Gigas is widely considered the only medieval Bible ever found with a full page of it dedicated to the devil himself. The image on the page shows him crouching but still at a height of 19 inches tall, brandishing his clawed hands above his head with dual tongues protruding from his mouth, wearing nothing aside from a spotted ermine loincloth, which historically, ermine cloth is associated with royalty, which helps signify the devil as the Prince of Darkness. He sits in a crouched position facing forward towards page 289, which has a depiction of the city of heaven adorning the entirety of the page. It's theorized the message intended by placing these two pages facing each other is to show the rewards of living a life with God on one and the consequences of living a sinful one on the other. From a reader's first impression, the Bible depicting the devil and honoring him with his own entire page during the medieval times could imply the monk author walks the line of neutrality more so than one of a strictly devout monk would typically be. Well, as I said earlier, the Codex Gigas consists of not only just its teachings and illustrations, but also many different forms of penitence and directions of conducting different kinds of exorcisms. It seems, even though the author went against what would be a norm of religious writers at the time, he still added ways to combat supernatural evils that could appear in the world, making the line the monks seemed to have walked was mainly a neutral one, but not denying or pretending the possible dangers of the world didn't exist. As is quite often the case with medieval texts regarding religion in such a way, ways to combat evil are commonplace in these sorts of books. Illness during medieval times were often contributed to being interactions or possessions from demons, so it was normal to find biblical texts from the church regarding ways to combat these sort of ailments. But these facts aren't what most would like to believe. Many enjoy believing in the strange and mysterious legend behind the book, one about a monk author dissolving his vows to pray to and work alongside Satan in exchange for saving his soul. As the legend goes, the soon-to-be author of the Codex Gigas had broken his sacred vows held dear by the black monks of the Benedictine monastery. As punishment, the monk elders decided his blasphemy was too great to forgive and began administering a harsh punishment of confining him to his small room as they began laying the bricks to wall him in alive. The monk's cry for mercy fell on the deaf ears of his fellow men, until, out of desperation, he made a promise believed by the elders to be impossible. The sinful monk promised he would write an entire book to glorify the monastery and include all known human knowledge. Now, perhaps it was out of sympathy or intrigue, they decided to hold off on dooming the man and decided to grant him a single night to produce such a book, knowing such a task was impossible for any person to accomplish. So they agreed, gave him his required pages, ink and quills, locked him in the room, and left him to his work. The night dragged on as the quill trembled in the nervous hand of the monk. It was midnight now, and he knew his fate was just hours away. After constant prayers to God and nothing coming, he realized his fellow monks were acting in the service of God. He knew he would get no help from his divine, and if he wouldn't help, perhaps praying to his opposite would. By the light of a solitary dim candle, the young monk let out a prayer to the fallen angel himself, Lucifer, to save him in his time of need. He sat quietly in his would-be tomb for what seemed like forever, but it seemed like his prayers had fallen on deaf ears again, and decided if anything, he should continue working until morning. When he reached for the ink and quill, he noticed the air turned ever so slightly colder, and the dim light of his candle began to flicker. Cold whispers came over his shoulder, and as he turned, saw the dark figure of his supposed rescuer. As the rest of the story goes, the young monk and Lucifer struck a deal. In exchange for the monk's soul, he would complete his impossible task of writing the book before daybreak. The devil remained true to his word and finished the book at the crack of dawn, and now forever grateful for his assistance, the monk added a full page into the book strictly for a portrait of his new savior. Now, I will admit, the legend of the devil coming to the aid of a distressed monk is much more entertaining than the idea that the Codex was written over the course of a few decades. People like to point out the few facts that support the legend in the fact that the calligraphy and penmanship with zero mistakes stays consistent throughout the entirety of the book is proof the origins of the Codex is one of supernatural talent at work. And this does hold true. Like I said before, over the course of even a decade, a single author would have had a change in penmanship during their time of writing this book, and if the experts are correct, it's estimated to have taken around 30 years to write it. Another fact is simply, this is a one-of-a-kind medieval book in the sense that it is currently the only one of its kind that portrays an entire page only for a picture of Lucifer. It's to be said that this book and this page of the devil came out of a monastery specifically existing to serve and worship God. For a monk to be creating an intricate portrait of the devil in the Bible, I imagine it would have been a tough sell to the monks in higher positions. The scenario in which the monk fell into wasn't uncommon for the time either though. Oftentimes those monks who fell into temptations like sexual deviancy, greed, or anything else that goes against their teachings at the monastery are punished with solitary confinement, lashings, excommunications, and in this rare case, indirect execution by being sealed inside a room. Whatever the monk in the legend did, it must have been incredibly offensive to the monastery. Only reason why I could suspect a monastery of religious monks would sentence one of their own to their death had to been something so contradictory to their beliefs, perhaps speaking with or praying to the devil. If this were the case, the monk caught conversing with Satan was locked into a room about to be sealed. In a desperate attempt to save his own life, he promises to write a book praising the monastery and God to prove he is still worthy of living. Of course, this challenge being impossible, he resorts to the very practice that might have gotten him in this mess to begin with, and calls upon Lucifer to help him escape his grim fate. Of course, this is all just speculation on my part, and we really have no clue if this legend is even real. Stories surrounding objects or creatures have been born out of much less, so it's not surprising an incredibly rare picture of the devil in the Codex Gigas would born a legend of its own. It also does not help the fact that Codex was born out of an era riddled with constant diseases, famine, fear, and war as the people in Europe faced death nearly every day. Monks of the Benedictine monastery weren't immune to these hardships either. They, like so many, fell desperate and were strapped for money as their supplies had slowly been dwindling each year. So in later 13th century, the black-robed monks of the Benedictine monastery reluctantly sold their prized and valuable Codex Gigas, which now became a symbol of great honor and higher status, to a Cistercian monastery of white-robed monks at the Sedlec ossuary in the town of Kutna-Hora. Now, I can personally say this new location for the Codex Gigas was one of uniqueness, as I've been to this small town as well as the ossuary itself. There are many people who know of the Sedlec ossuary as one being out of the ordinary, as the walls, furniture, coat of arms, and even an entire chandelier are made from the remains of 40 to 70,000 human bones. It's often called the Bone Chapel. It's a spectacular work of creativity, but at the time the Codex Gigas was brought here, the large Gothic church which houses so many bones hadn't been built yet. Mainly, it wasn't until the end of the bubonic plague did the plans to build a larger home for the remains of the dead to be built here, but the grounds on which the church was built were the very same grounds the Codex Gigas was brought to. But of course, as history would have it, the Codex was not to last long in this location. The Bible was taken to the Imperial Library of Rudolf II in Prague, and was later one of the many spoils of war taken by the Swedish army during the 30-Year War in 17th century, which took place throughout most of Central Europe, leaving millions dead. At this point, the Codex Gigas would travel across the many kilometers to its new and permanent home at the Royal Library of Stockholm. And here the book would remain for hundreds of years, kept as a monumental bounty of war under the rule of Sweden's female king Christina, until her own self-relinquishing of the throne and leaving for Rome, taking many of her prized books with her. However, most likely due to its size and suspected power of the Codex Gigas, she leaves behind the book, where it would remain in the lap of luxury as a focal point for many curious academics wondering what had brought about such a book into existence. But nearly 50 years into its stay at the Royal Library, an enormous fire broke out, destroying many precious books and materials. The Codex was fortunate enough to be saved by a castle servant who was able to hoist the 160-pound book out of its holder and threw it out a nearby window to the ground below. And perhaps it was out of luck or mysterious power of the book, but the fall wasn't as lethal for it as one might suspect. The supposed reason why the book survives its long fall is, according to legend, it manages to break its own fall by landing on a passerby who unfortunately found themselves in a classic case of being at the wrong spot at the wrong time. One could call this a bittersweet moment, however. If it wasn't for that person breaking the fall of the book, more damage or even complete destruction of the book could have taken place. But by landing on the passerby, the book only suffered breaking a few metal ornaments on the cover, cracking of the wood binding, and knocking a few loose pages free, which mysteriously disappeared. Even when modern experts look through the book to see if they can find any markings, rips or tears, or even any burn marks caused by the fire, none are to be found. Most curious enough though, a few pages seem to have developed a strange burn-like shadow among their lettering. If this was caused by the fire, it should have curled or burnt the outsides of the pages before making shadows among the lettering, and even melting the ink written to create such lettering. But remarkably, this isn't the case. As strange as it sounds, the dark shadowy burns only appear on a few pages, all of which are right near the portrait of the devil. The Codex Gigas seems like a book of great mystery, with it being a one-of-a-kind book surrounded by an intriguing legend of the devil coming to the aid of a doomed monk to write it. The strange contents of magical spells, exorcism protocols, and the portrait of the devil himself all lead the superstitious to believe it was Satan who intervened and produced such a book. But experts are led to believe the legend behind the Bible is one of misunderstanding. The pages I mentioned just before show the discoloration and burnt-like shadows mainly on the pages near the portrait of the devil, but it's commonly known UV light from the sun can cause discoloration in ink and vellum paper, and if we consider over the past 800 years the Codex Gigas has been around, the pages surrounding the portrait of the devil and the city of heaven are the ones most likely looked at by curious minds throughout the ages, which would allow plenty of time for UV light to discolor the pages. Also, a Latin written name in the back of the Codex's credits offer up more of an explanation to the possible author. Herman Inclusus, or Herman the Recluse. A monk not forced into isolation for his blasphemy, desecration, or sacrilege, but a man choosing to dedicate his life to the work of the Codex, away from his peers. A man who spent nearly 30 long years writing a book that to this day has captivated the minds and hearts of thousands of people around the world. Perhaps it was the devil, or perhaps it was sheer will and dedication from a reclusive monk who brought forth the Codex Gigas 800 years ago. It would seem, whichever origin one chooses to believe, we can all agree the Codex Gigas has become one of the most impressive medieval works of literature to ever have existed. Hey there everyone, I just wanted to jump in at the end of the episode to let you all know that Moonlight Lore has an Instagram page, and now also a Twitter page, where I've been and will continue to post pictures and updates of specific episodes talked about on the podcast. If you're interested, feel free to give me a follow on Instagram at Moonlight Lore Podcast, or at Lore Moonlight on Twitter. And if you're wondering how you could help support and grow the podcast, simply by listening does just that. But if you want to go even further, leaving a 5-star review on whatever app you're listening on, and by sharing this podcast with your friends and family who you think might be interested, would help immensely. I appreciate all of you for listening to Moonlight Lore, so thank you, and I hope you've been enjoying it. Take care and stay safe.